The morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Linda Evans stood on her porch, sipping a cup of coffee. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air smelled like fallen leaves and wood smoke, but today felt different. There was a strange weight in her chest, an unease she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the changing seasons, or maybe it was the way her thoughts had drifted, like they so often did, to the past. 22 years had passed, yet she still remembered that day as if it had just happened. The day her husband, Mark, and their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, left for what was supposed to be a short vacation. A weekend trip to the mountains, just the two of them. A little father-daughter bonding time. They had packed their bags with excitement, Mark promising to take Emily on her first real hiking trip, to let her see the stars away from the city lights. But they never came back. Linda had waited for their return that Sunday night. She had made dinner, set the table, and even lit the candles. But as the hours dragged on, her concern grew into fear. Calls to Mark's phone went straight to voicemail. The authorities were contacted. The search began. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually the world moved on. But Linda never did. Her husband and daughter had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and an unbearable emptiness. The case had been investigated, theories had been thrown around. Was it an accident? Foul play? A decision to start over somewhere else? But no real answers ever came. Just silence. Until today. Linda's hands trembled as she sorted through her mail, pausing when she saw the envelope. It was plain, unmarked except for her name, written in a handwriting that sent chills down her spine. It was familiar. It was Mark's. Her breath hitched. Her fingers shook as she tore the envelope open, heart pounding as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The words were brief. "Linda, I'm sorry. I never wanted to disappear. Emily is alive. I never stopped loving you." The world around her blurred. Her knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing. This had to be a cruel joke, a mistake. But deep in her heart, she knew it wasn't. For the first time in 22 years, there was hope. And maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally within reach. Linda's heart raced as she sat down at the kitchen table, the letter still clutched in her hand. Her mind swirled with questions, each one more desperate than the last. How could this be possible? Where have they been all this time? Why now, after so many years? Her mind flashed back to the years following their disappearance, the frantic search, the endless sleepless nights, the false hope, and the gut-wrenching realization that she might never know what happened. The authorities had done everything they could, but in the end, the trail went cold. The mountain trails they planned to hike had been scoured, their car found abandoned near a remote campsite, and then nothing. It was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. Friends and family had tried to support her, but no one really knew what to say. Linda had learned to live with the uncertainty, to fill the hole in her heart with routines and distractions, but the ache never went away. It was always there, lurking, a shadow she couldn't escape. And now this letter, this unbelievable, surreal letter, had thrown her entire world into chaos once again. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to disappear." The words repeated in her mind, like a whisper she couldn't shake. She thought about Mark, the love of her life, the man she had trusted with everything. His disappearance had broken her in ways she couldn't explain. There had always been whispers, rumors that perhaps he had run off with another woman, that maybe he had grown tired of their life together. But Linda had never believed that. It didn't make sense. Mark loved their daughter more than anything. He was the kind of father who could spend hours with Emily, teaching her to ride a bike or telling her bedtime stories. The thought of him abandoning her, of abandoning Emily, seemed impossible. No, something else had happened, something out of their control. And now the letter suggested he was still out there, alive. But where had he been all this time? What kind of life had he been living? And what about Emily? Linda's mind couldn't stop racing. She needed answers. She had to know where they were, what had happened, and why. But as much as she wanted to reach out, to call someone, to demand answers, a sense of caution held her back. The letter had left her with as many questions as it answered. There was no phone number, no return address, nothing to follow up on, just those cryptic words, "I never stopped loving you." It was as if Mark had left a trail of breadcrumbs, just enough to lure her back into the nightmare she had spent so many years trying to forget. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to take action, to find out where he was, to bring her family back together. But was it safe? Could she trust this letter, or was someone playing with her? The longer she sat there, the more her emotions swirled in a chaotic spiral. Fear, hope, anger, confusion. How could she ever trust anyone again? Linda's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She stood up quickly, startled. Her mind was still reeling from the letter, and she couldn't remember the last time someone had knocked on her door unannounced. She walked slowly toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest, and opened it just a crack. Standing on the other side was a man she didn't recognize. His face was weathered, his expression grave. He had the look of someone who had been through something difficult, someone who wasn't offering good news. "Can I help you?" Linda asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. "My name is Richard. I'm a private investigator," the man said quietly. "I've been hired to look into the disappearance of your husband and daughter." Linda's stomach churned. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was it more tied to the letter? Her instincts told her that something was happening, something larger than she could understand. I don't understand," she stammered. "Why now, after all these years?" Richard's eyes darkened as he looked past her, as if he were weighing his words carefully. "I know this is hard to believe, but I have information that could help you find your family." Linda's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, letting him in. Her mind screamed to question him, but a part of her was desperate for any piece of the puzzle. Richard sat down across from her, his hands folded tightly in front of him. "You got the letter, didn't you?" he asked softly. Linda nodded, "Yes. But how do you know that?" "I've been investigating the case for some time," Richard explained. "Your husband and daughter, they didn't disappear by choice. It was all part of something bigger." Linda's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "There's a group of people, very powerful people, who have been involved in these kinds of disappearances. I've traced several similar cases, and they all lead to the same place." He paused, as if weighing the impact of his words. "The letter you received, it's real. Your husband is alive, and he's been trying to get in touch with you. But he's been forced to stay hidden." Linda's mind reeled. Who would do such a thing? Why? The possibilities were endless, but the one thing that stood out was the most painful question of all: how much of it had been out of Mark's control? Richard continued, "There's more to this than you think, Linda. The reason they disappeared, the reason they were kept from you, it's all connected to something much larger. And I believe Mark and Emily are in danger." Linda felt the room grow colder as the weight of his words sank in. If Mark and Emily were truly alive, what kind of life had they been living? And why hadn't they reached out sooner? What had kept them silent for all these years? She felt the tension in her chest build. Her entire world was on the verge of being turned upside down. And as Richard stood up to leave, he gave her one last warning. "You need to be careful, Linda. Whoever did this, they're still watching, and they won't let you find the truth without a fight." Linda stood frozen in the doorway, staring after him as he walked away. Her heart was racing, her mind overwhelmed with the weight of everything she'd just learned. But one thing was certain: she was no longer just waiting for answers. She was going to fight for them, and whatever it took, she would get her family back. The clock was ticking. Linda barely slept that night, the weight of Richard's words pressing on her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said: danger, hidden forces, and the truth, and she knew deep down that whatever was happening, she was in the thick of it now. Her life had already been shattered once by Mark and Emily's disappearance, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. But the fear that gnawed at her was suffocating. The next morning, Linda found herself standing in front of the police station, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. She had to find answers. She had to understand what happened all those years ago. She couldn't sit back and wait any longer. The letter had given her a spark of hope, but it was fragile. She was on the verge of a new beginning, but she could feel that the forces working against her were still lurking in the shadows. Inside, she was greeted by Detective Harris, the officer who had led the investigation into Mark and Emily's disappearance. His face was grim when she explained why she was there. She told him about Richard, the investigator, and the letter. He listened intently, his brow furrowing in concentration as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Linda, I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've seen some strange things, but what you're telling me, it's almost too much to believe." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of skepticism and sympathy. "But if there's even a shred of truth to this, we need to dig deeper than we've ever dug before." Linda nodded, determination setting in. She wasn't leaving without answers, no matter how dangerous the truth might be. She couldn't. Harris stood up, moving to his filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. "There's one thing I've never told you. Something I've kept hidden for all these years." His voice dropped to a whisper. "There were whispers about the organization behind your family's disappearance, whispers that went all the way to the top. But it was too big, too powerful. I couldn't touch it." Linda's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the rumors, but never anything concrete. The idea that there was a powerful entity pulling strings, making people disappear, it felt too unreal. And yet, here it was. Harris handed her the folder. "You need to see this. I've kept track of every lead, every piece of evidence, and I think it's time you knew the full story." His eyes were filled with regret, but there was also a sense of finality. Linda took the folder and began scanning through the documents. Her breath caught in her throat as she read. It was all there, the connections, the people involved, and the undeniable truth. Mark and Emily hadn't just vanished. They had been taken, not by some random criminal, but by an organization that specialized in forced disappearances, using people as pawns in a much larger game. And Mark had been trapped in it, just like Emily. The letter hadn't just been a message of love. It had been a warning. But Linda wasn't ready to let this organization win. She wasn't going to let them take her family without a fight. She had come this far. She would see it through. With the information she had gathered, Linda, Harris, and Richard began to piece together the final details. Their investigation led them to an isolated mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that had been linked to the mysterious group. It was here that they believed Mark and Emily were being held, alive, but under strict surveillance. The confrontation was tense. The group didn't want anyone to find out what they had been hiding. But Linda, fueled by a mother's love and the truth she had uncovered, didn't back down. She barged in, demanding to see her family. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she saw them. Mark, older, his face wary but still full of life, and Emily, now a young woman, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at her mother. It was an overwhelming, surreal moment. Linda rushed to them, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe that after all these years, they were standing in front of her. "I never stopped looking for you," Linda whispered through her tears. Mark reached out, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry, Linda. I never wanted you to suffer like this. But they wouldn't let us go. They made us stay hidden for so long. I couldn't risk contacting you. It was too dangerous. But I've always loved you." The weight of those words hit Linda like a tidal wave. All these years of pain and confusion melted away in that moment. It was a complicated and painful truth, but it was the truth. Mark and Emily had been forced into hiding, not by their own choice, but by the ruthless actions of an organization that had kept them trapped. And yet, they were free now, together, safe. As Linda embraced her family, she knew the battle wasn't over. The organization that had kept them apart would still be out there, lurking in the shadows. But she also knew that nothing, not even the most powerful forces, could tear her family apart again. They had been through too much to be broken now. The road ahead would be difficult. The fight for justice would take time. But for the first time in 22 years, Linda felt a sense of peace. The missing pieces had been put back together. The truth had been revealed. And no matter what came next, she had her family. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they walked out of that mansion, Linda knew that nothing, no one, could ever take away the love they shared. They were survivors, and their story was far from over.